I'm Joe Halco, Director of Community Relations for Northwestern Counseling and Support Services, and welcome to another episode of NCSS Here for You. Since 1958, Northwestern Counseling and Support Services has been providing access to high-quality services which promote healthy living and emotional well-being to the residents of Franklin and Grand Isle counties. Over the years, as the needs of the community have changed, so too have the programs and services that we make available to assist children, adolescents, adults, families, and seniors. We take our role in the community seriously and strive to provide a continuum of the highest quality services to meet the needs of individuals who at any point are struggling and seek assistance. This month's episode is titled Homelessness and Housing Insecurity. Have you stopped lately to gain a greater understanding of a very real circumstance that many individuals and families face throughout Franklin County? And that's homelessness and housing insecurity. Do you realize that each day there are local individuals and families living in emergency shelters or in their cars, while some are couch surfing or living in outdoor encampments? Homelessness and housing insecurity is more prevalent here in our local community than you might imagine. To discuss the current state of homelessness and housing insecurity in Franklin County, I'm pleased to introduce this month's guests. They are Jess Graff, who is the Associate Director for Franklin Grand Isle Community Action, and Holly Olio, Service Coordinator on the Community Support Services team at NCSS. I'd like to welcome both of you to the show this month.
Thank you for having us.
So let's start with, when reviewing the information that's available, what do we have for homelessness in Franklin County?
So I think if we take a look at our first slide, we're referencing the point in time count, and this is, I think, one of our most influential sources of information in deciding funding coming into the community.
Mm-hmm.
And so the point in time count is a count of people experiencing homelessness on a predetermined night nationwide. So HUD, Housing and Urban Development Department of the federal government, predetermines an evening to do this count, right? And so this year, in 2021, it took place on January 22nd. It's usually around like the third week in January or so when we do this count. And so this is a count looking at people who are in shelters, also people who are in the motel system paid for through the state general assistance emergency housing funds, as well as people who happen to be unsheltered, right? So that could be people living in encampments, that could be people staying in their cars, really any place not meant specifically for human habitation. As you can see the slide, in 2020, just before the pandemic and the governor kind of shut everything down for the state, took place, we had a count of 77 individuals who were experiencing homelessness on that night. And as you'll see this year, on January 22nd, that jumped to 185 counted individuals. I think also, too, it's important to note with the point in time count is that these are really only representation of the numbers of the folks that we can connect with.
Sure.
Right? So we know that there are other people experiencing homelessness that we haven't had access to or we haven't had communication with, especially on that particular evening. It's also, I think, important to note that that count really looks at homelessness as defined by the federal government, which does not count people who happen to be in temporary stays. That could be with friends, family, or wherever, otherwise known as couch surfing, it's commonly referred to. So the count also doesn't look at those numbers. So we know the numbers in our area are certainly higher than our counts are showing. And then I think, despite the high number, as I was saying, right, despite the high number that we're showing for 2021, it really is not a fully accurate representation of what's going on in the community. And if we take a look at the next slide, you'll see that based on our coordinated entry system, which is another system for obtaining data, maintaining data. This is a data system that really categorizes people who are experiencing homelessness into groups around what resources may be available to them. And it's also a tool used for resource and referral for complex needs. So you'll see that we currently have 120 households or 176 people enrolled in our coordinated entry system. Again, this only counts people who are known to us, right, and to the system itself. So of that 176 people, we're currently looking at 143 of those people are adults and 33 are children experiencing homelessness. Higher number of people identifying as male than female, 98 households without children, and 22 households with children. And then I would say like the biggest age group, with about 70% being represented, is 18 to 54. And then with about 40% being ages 25 to 44. And I think another thing to take note is what we're also seeing as a result of the pandemic is that people are experiencing homelessness longer than they have before, which this last bit of information shows is that 65% of the people enrolled in our coordinated entry system have been homeless between about 3 months and a year, which is a really long time to go without a stable place to call your own. Yeah. And then if we take a look at the next slide, I think it'll really show as well that housing insecurity is a really complex system of issues. And so Jess will talk a little bit more about the demographics.
Yeah, Holly's right. Homelessness has many faces, right? For example, households experiencing homelessness, there are absolutely households experiencing homelessness that are employed full-time, but their income doesn't support the local rent rates. In Vermont, the housing wage would be $22.78 an hour in order to support rental portions, and the minimum wage in the state is $10.96. So there's a big gap there.
Sure. Yeah.
So absolutely, we see a lot of people who are working full-time come into homelessness who just don't make enough money to support average rental rates in this area. But however, right now, what we're looking at in coordinated entry, the primary demographic are single individuals without children between the ages of 25 and 45, many of whom have some type of disabling condition, and many complex issues and struggles and traumatic experiences in their history that present housing barriers.
Well, the eye-opening part of everything that both of you have said is when you talk about that huge gap between the minimum wage amount and what it actually takes because of the rents and the fact that the rents are not inexpensive. So a lot of times I think when people talk about homelessness, they have one view. That would not be a view I don't think that a lot of people would have, or you know what I mean, just in general. And that's huge. That is absolutely huge. Now, when looking at the past 2 years, why are the numbers so different? Because when Holly brought them up, they're startlingly different.
Yeah, I think we have a slide that shows the percent increase over the last couple of years. It's significant. I think that we are looking at about 140% increase this year from last year. And across the state, that was pretty consistent with about 126% increase across the state as well. And there are many reasons why the pandemic may have led to an increase in homelessness. For example, people who were doubled up or couch surfing in overcrowded situations that made social distancing and isolation really difficult. And so people might have temporarily needed to leave those situations and come into shelters and the motel program because of that. But actually what we're seeing, what we think we're seeing is a really more honest and accurate view of what homelessness looks like in our region. So really, before the pandemic, there were not programs and services to meet the need. We have our local shelter, the Samaritan House, which has 22 beds available. And really, for the last several years, they've had a waiting list that could get as high as 100 people. And so if you add those numbers up, the point in time count from 2020, which was 77, along with the 100 people that were at any given time on the wait list, you get something really similar to what we're seeing now. So we believe that these numbers are really a more accurate view of literal homelessness in our communities.
Now, where would we find all of these people?
In our region, we have two shelters. We have the Samaritan House that has a 22-bed capacity, and we have Lori's House, which is a program that's run by Voices Against Violence that supports survivors of domestic violence, and they have a shelter capacity of about 12 beds. But what happened because of the pandemic was that the shelters in the state made a decision to move towards what they call non-congregate shelter living. Shelters are often, smaller spaces with several beds in them. And in order to keep everyone safe and distanced because of COVID, they moved into an expansion of a program that provides motel vouchers so that people could be in designated spaces and safely shelter in place and isolate from each other. So right now, I think we have a graphic that shows that primarily people are living in the motels. There are still some people in shelters, but about 70% of individuals in our region are in those motels. And there's people in transitional housing programs. Both the shelters offer transitional housing programs. And as well, we have a population of people that are living outside in encampments.
Okay. So let's move to the types of services that have been available to people that have been housed in the motels, as you mentioned, Jess.
Sure. So as Jess was saying a little earlier, the Samaritan House has been able to hire a couple of staff members through funding available through the pandemic, and they are on site at the motels. That is where their positions are located, and they're able to help with safety, right, as well as service referrals. Northwestern Counseling and Support Services have also been active during the pandemic. We have housing case management as well as housing navigation services. And the difference between the two is housing navigation is really kind of shorter term up to the point, right, where a household becomes housed. And case management is just really more ongoing. And so those services are available. Our mobile crisis team through NCSS was also able, for lack of a better word, to mobilize, right? And to also do some outreach to the motels. And they've also been providing some housing navigation as well. Our parent-child center also has a youth housing navigator, and her role is really very specific to that youth demographics to really help with housing and accessing the resources that are available to that age demographic. The RJC, or the Restorative Justice Center, also has housing case management, and that is really tailored for folks who have had involvement with the Department of Corrections. Pathways provides case management as well, housing case management through the Family Supportive Housing Program. Voices Against Violence, as you've already heard, has a shelter. They also offer housing case management and navigation. Our local community action has also been able to hire, I believe it's one staff person, Jess?
That's correct.
Okay. For households who are receiving what's called a CARES voucher, but we'll talk a little bit more about that later. And then even our local economic services department through Reach Up also offers case management. And then Age Well is really available for housing navigation for our older population of clients who happen to be over the age of 60 or over the age of 60.
So really, when you get down to it, a lot of organizations that are fully wrapping around these individuals and families as best as they can.
Yeah, and we work really well together. It's funny to look at it as a list of different agencies, because we feel like one team. You know, we really are meeting several times a week all together.
Yes.
And well-oiled machine in terms of making sure that people are getting to the service that best meets their needs.
Yeah, and that's critically important, especially with the numbers that you're talking about for this area. So let's talk about the kind of housing supports and services that are available. Now, not so much the motel scenario, but just in general, that are available.
There's a lot of programs and services that are available to assist people, and we actually have a slide that lists some of them that are more specific to the motel population. There's really been an increase in funding both from the federal and the state level that is providing assistance. And what we have in this list is a list of really financial supports that are available to people. We saw an increase in allocations of Vermont rental subsidies, which we refer to as VRSs. There were 100 new Vermont rental subsidies that were released during the pandemic statewide, and I believe that we received around 15 of those here. We have CARES vouchers, which is a new voucher that came from federal funding designated to be responsive to homelessness during the pandemic. And in our region, we received 51 of those CARES vouchers. And also the funding to have one full-time CARES housing retention specialist that works with those households. The CARES vouchers, like the Vermont rental subsidy vouchers, were primarily allocated to families with children. And both vouchers are what we call medium-term vouchers, meaning that they are designated for maybe 12 months or 18 months. But they are also both what we call preference vouchers, meaning that after several months of successful tenancy, the case manager can assist the voucher recipient in signing up for a Section 8 or a housing choice voucher, which is a long-term permanent voucher that they can continue to have as long as they income qualify. And so in our region so far, about 25 of the households who received the CARES vouchers have been able to lease up, and we still have another 26 or so that are looking. One of the unfortunate things about the CARES vouchers is that because it was funded with funding that was part of the COVID response funding, it's time limited, and so those 26 or so households that are still looking only have until July to lease up with units and have active leases, or they'll lose those vouchers. But there's other funding that could be available to them. We have Rapid Resolution Housing Initiative funding, which is very flexible funding that can be used really for anybody in the motel or shelters or sleeping outside, anyone in that category 1 literal homelessness category, that can pay for things like security deposits, rental assistance for 3 months, utility deposits, even vehicle repairs if necessary, really anything that supports a permanent and safe living situation. And we also have the Housing Opportunity Program, which is something that we've had for many years, but that can be used similarly for security deposits and rental assistance, utility payments. And then, of course, there's the sort of newer Vermont Emergency Rental Assistance Program, which is funded by a federal allocation. that the state received that is available to the community in general who are really struggling with housing insecurity, and that can cover security deposits and rental assistance in 3-month increments for up to 18 months. So lots of great programs and services really available to support people in getting safely and permanently, sustainably housed.
Yeah, that's terrific. Now, I've heard that there are upcoming changes to the program that will take effect in the near future. And could you please elaborate on what the changes will be?
Yes. So some of those changes have already started. So throughout the pandemic, Economic Services Division, through their emergency housing program, has housed more than 5,000 people throughout the state at motels. And that has been pretty expensive, with a cost of about $6 million a month, which is primarily funded by FEMA, a federal allocation of funding, because we have been operating under a declared state of emergency due to the pandemic. And now we're close to the state of emergency being lifted, and that funding will wind down, and the program is simply not sustainable moving forward without the federal funding. Additionally, with the lifting of travel restrictions, many of the motels are looking to reopen to tourists. And so participation in the program is voluntary by the motels. And as they turn back towards tourism, they are choosing to sort of disengage and disenroll from the program. And so there's just a decrease in available room capacity. So starting June 1st, there were changes to who could qualify for a motel room through the emergency housing program coming in. There have always been some restrictions and qualifying guidelines about that. For example, income limits of who could qualify. And so many of the restrictions are similar to what we had before, but are coming back. And I think that there is a slide with a list of some of those categorical eligibility guidelines that we can look at. It's really targeted towards the vulnerable population, the most vulnerable population. So people who have a disability, families with children, a person 60 years or older, a household that includes a pregnant person, or loss of housing because of a natural disaster, or an illegal eviction. Those are the categories. And so that has already gone into effect. And then we're looking, after July 1st, we're looking at those same categorical eligibility guidelines being in place for those individuals who are currently in the motel. And so in our region, as of yesterday, we had 80 rooms and with a total of 118 people, which was 99 adults and 19 children. And after July 1st, it looks like in our region, 36% of those households will 36 of the households will no longer be eligible, which is about 44 people.
Now, with these changes taking effect, where will all these people go?
Well, that's a really excellent question, and one as a community and community partners we've been trying to answer. And I think we really don't have a great answer, to be honest. I think given the complexity of people's needs, right, and the limitations on resources in our area, I think kind of bottom line, we don't have enough affordable housing to house everyone. It feels like we now have, more funding and financial support available than we've had certainly in my time working in housing through NCSS, right? But now we just don't seem to have the housing stock. And I would say, I think we also have more case management services than the community has probably seen to help people maintain their housing and to obtain housing. I think we're going to have to be pretty creative in trying to figure out some of these solutions. And we're still certainly working on that and trying to figure that out for folks.
I think we're hoping that shelters will be able to increase the capacity of people that they're having in shelter as social distancing and other restrictions lift. So we're really hoping to be able to take some of them back into shelter if they so choose. And again, that's, only 22 beds available at the
Yeah.
Samaritan House.
Yeah.
And so in addition, to these changes with Economic Services Division's emergency housing program, there's currently an eviction moratorium in Vermont for non-payment of rent, and that is set to expire 30 days after the state of emergency is lifted. So we are anticipating that quite possibly around mid-July, July 15th, the eviction moratorium would lift, and we are concerned that that would also lead to more people being evicted and moving into homelessness as well. So there's reason to believe we're going to see an influx of people coming in as the capacity to provide shelter diminishes. And at the same time, we have a real crisis of available housing, which is national and state and also local. A quick search this week on sort of some of the major social media platforms that advertise housing, apartments and such, only had 2 postings available in St. Albans and none for any of the other towns in Franklin County. Really what's needed to just provide housing to the current individuals in coordinated entry is about 131 one-bedroom apartments, 21 two-bedroom apartments, and 5 three-bedroom apartments. And so you can see there's a real sort of disproportionate number of available units compared to what the need is.
Yeah, and, both of you have said it many times throughout this show, but this is certainly an extremely complex issue and one that's going to take a lot of people sitting around the table trying to figure out what is going to be the best way to approach this, because there has to be an answer at some point to try to figure this out and make things better. But I do realize there are so many factors that come into play. Certainly the affordable housing scenario is, right at the top of it. So, it's something that, we'll certainly keep an eye on, and I'd really love to have you come on again at some point in the future that we can continue this conversation and see what happened post-pandemic with this situation. So, with that being said, believe it or not, our time is up, and I want to thank my guests, Jess Graff and Holly Olio, for being on the show today and sharing their insights on the state of homelessness and housing insecurity in Franklin County. I also want to thank you, the viewer, for spending time with us again this month. You can go to ncssinc.org to learn more about all of our programs and services. I'm Joe Halco, and I'll be back next month with another episode of NCSS Here for You.